Today, we're diving into a story that starts with an absolutely unthinkable crime, a brutal family murder that, to this day, remains unsolved. But this isn't just a true crime explainer. No, this is the story of how that one horrific act of violence helped trigger the downfall of an authoritarian regime and, believe it or not, helped forge a democracy. Let's get into how a single tragedy really did change an entire nation.
It all begins with this one cold, hard fact. While a man named Lin Yi-hisung was locked away in prison for his pro-democracy activism, someone broke into his home and brutally attacked his family, his 60-year-old mother and his 7-year-old twin daughters. They were stabbed to death. But that, somehow, isn't even the most chilling part of this whole mystery. You see, the Lin family home wasn't just any old house. It was being watched, around the clock, by the state's own intelligence agencies. We're talking wiretaps, agents on the ground, constant monitoring. So the question that has haunted Taiwan for over 40 years is this: how could an assassin get in, commit such a savage crime, and then just vanish without a single trace, all while the government was supposedly watching every move? So let's start with the crime itself. This is the Lin family massacre. It happened on February 28, 1980. And that date is important because it already held a really dark meaning in Taiwanese history. This wasn't just a murder. It was an act of terror. It was designed to send a message. And the human cost was just devastating. Lin Yi-xiong's mother, Lin Yu-ame, and his twin 7-year-old daughters were killed. His oldest daughter, 9-year-old Lin Huan-chun, was stabbed over and over, but somehow miraculously she survived. And you have to remember, all of this happened while their father, a leading voice for democracy, was in prison, being interrogated by the very regime that had his house surrounded. Now, to really understand why this happened, we have to hit rewind and go back a few months. The massacre wasn't some random act of violence. It was the direct fallout from a political firestorm that had erupted in 1979, known as the Formosa Incident. At the very heart of this firestorm was something called the Dangwai movement. The word literally means outside the party, and it was a name for this gutsy coalition of activists, including Lin Yi-xiong. These were the people who dared to challenge the Kuomintang's one-party dictatorship. Now, forming another political party was illegal, so they weren't one. But they used things like magazines to call for an end to decades of martial law and demand actual, real democracy. Things really boiled over on December 10, 1979. The Dangwai organized a rally in the city of Kaohsiung to mark International Human Rights Day. The regime saw this as a direct threat. Riot police surrounded the rally, they fired tear gas, and chaos erupted. The government then used this clash as the perfect excuse to launch a massive crackdown, arresting pretty much every single major figure in the entire democracy movement. So the government's plan was pretty simple: crush the movement for good with a big televised military show trial. But this turned into one of the biggest miscalculations they could have possibly made. Instead of silencing the opposition, the trial gave them a national stage. Okay, now what's so fascinating about the slide is who you see here. On the left, you've got the defendants, the Formosa 8, including Lin Yi-xiong, who got a 12-year sentence. But then, look at their defense team on the right. A bunch of young, sharp lawyers who stepped up to defend them. You might recognize some of their names: Chen Shui-bian, Frank Si, Su Tseng-chung. These guys would go on to become presidents and premiers of a democratic Taiwan. The regime, in trying to crush a movement, had accidentally created its own successors. Now, because of international pressure, the trial was actually open to the media, and the defendants, they seized this moment. They used the courtroom to make these eloquent, powerful cases for democracy. Their testimonies, like this one right here, basically turned the trial into a nationwide democracy classroom. Public sympathy, which had been stamped out by fear for so long, started to swing big time toward the movement, especially after the horrific news of the Lin family massacre broke right in the middle of the trial. Which brings us back to the massacre itself. For 40 years, the case just sat there. It went cold. The official investigation led nowhere, and it really seemed like the truth was just buried for good. But in recent years, declassified government files have started to paint a terrifying new picture of what really happened. The regime needed a suspect, and they found a pretty convenient one, an Australian academic named Bruce Jacobs. Now, Jacobs was a friend of the Lin family. He'd even visited their home on the morning of the attack, so the intelligence agencies immediately zeroed in on him. leaking stories to the press about a mysterious, bearded foreigner to steer any and all suspicion away from the state. Jacobs was interrogated for hours, put under house arrest, and treated like the #1 suspect. He was eventually deported and banned from returning to Taiwan for 12 years. As he said himself, the whole point of the investigation was never to find the killer. It was to manage the story and bury the facts. 40. It took 40 years for just one piece of evidence to be declassified that proved beyond any doubt that Jacobs was innocent. And get this. It was a recording of a phone call he made to the Lin family home around midday on the day of the murders. The intelligence agency had this tape the entire time. Not only did it prove he wasn't at the scene, but it also proved the children were still alive at that time, which completely contradicted the official government timeline. A government report from just 2023 finally laid bare the massive scale of this cover-up. I mean, just look at this list. The intelligence agencies were found to have illegally directed the police investigation, deliberately misled them with false suspects, destroyed key evidence, and even protected organized crime figures. Basically, they didn't just fail to solve the crime, they actively got in the way of anyone who tried. So here's the bottom line. Reports from Taiwan's Transitional Justice Commission, all based on these newly declassified files, have come to a really shocking conclusion. They confirm, yes, the house was under 24/7 surveillance. Yes, key records from the day of the murder were hidden or destroyed, and that the massacre was highly likely carried out with the knowledge, if not the direct involvement of state authorities. An unsolved murder, a state-sponsored cover-up. I know, it's an incredibly dark story, but the legacy of this tragedy is also one of incredible strength and transformation, both for Lin Yi-hyung as a person and for Taiwan as a whole. When Lin Yi-hyung was finally released from prison in 1984, he faced an impossible choice. I mean, after losing your mother and 2 of your children in an attack like that, an attack that was clearly political, nobody would have blamed him for choosing a path of anger, of revenge. But instead, he chose forgiveness. He chose to take that grief and build something with it. He channeled that unimaginable pain into a force for positive change. He started an educational foundation. He went on to lead the Democratic Progressive Party, the very party that grew out of that old Deng Wai movement, to its very first presidential victory in 2000, which was Taiwan's first peaceful transfer of power. This absolute commitment to nonviolent progress is why he became known as Taiwan's Gandhi. He transformed his own personal tragedy into a public legacy of healing and democracy for everyone. And what about the home where it all happened? Well, the Lin family eventually donated it, and it was transformed into the Jikong Church. What was once a place of just an imaginable horror is now a national landmark, a place for remembrance, for peace, and a quiet, constant demand for the truth. And that really brings us to the final question. The crime is still officially unsolved. Many of the key figures from that time are gone, and a lot of government files are still sealed, hidden behind national security. So after more than 40 years, what does justice actually look like? Is it a conviction in a courtroom, or is it the full, unvarnished, and ugly truth, no matter how dark, finally being brought into the light for everyone to see? That's the question that Taiwan is still grappling with today.